hear you and see you, Joe.
All right, excellent. And hopefully the slide. All right. Well, I appreciate the invitation. It is not often that people actually have the opportunity to hear me speak and have experience with me and then come back and invite me again. So that's very welcome. I want to take the time to really kind of say that I'm dabbling into something that is a little bit outside of a comfort zone, and that's certainly not a bad thing, and something that I hope that we all have the opportunity to do a little bit of. So I'm going to talk today about the burden and benefits of bias in fisheries, and really to set the stage a little bit, first to highlight that what we do in fisheries is really deal with people. And so a lot of the work that I've been fortunate enough to do has really come full circle from the fisheries questions to how decisions are being made and the people that they are influencing. And so if we think about fisheries as a profession, we're really those who are using knowledge of fish and fisheries to try to make social decisions. And that can be people who are using the river for different reasons, traditional, commercial, recreational, and so on and so forth. And so in that vein, I wanted to really couch this as something where we're looking at decision making. And for those of you who now have experienced the Department of Interior, you're probably well versed in some of the ideas that are associated with structured decision making and such, and maybe reading a book that was co-authored by Keeney, who really talks about how to make decisions and how they get carried forth. And in a 2004 paper, Keeney kind of structurally laid out what decisions are being made, and importantly, what kind of range there is for those decisions. And so, you know, a lot of the questions that we deal with on a daily level are really what would be termed no-brainers, things that we don't really need to spend much time about. You know, if somebody says, do you want free tickets? Sure, take free tickets. Others might be things that have potentially very low consequences. You know, it comes around 11 o'clock, somebody asks you, do you want to order for lunch or not? And then there's a small fraction that might be a range of questions that really require some rational thought. And those are things that can end up having consequences for individuals, and certainly are ones that really demand the attention, or sometimes demand the attention of being able to go forth and come up with a good decision. And so those are the ones that are worth thinking about. And if you wanted to go and explore that, Keeney goes and has a dendritic breakdown of how those different questions get analyzed. But I guess I wanted to break off there and really highlight the idea that we don't really do well at thinking about the questions that we ought to, and many of them are influenced by our trends and how we analyze things. And so the things that we tend to do, things like procrastinating, right? It's very easy to put difficult decisions off until they are incipient, and then of course you're stuck making the decisions that you need to. Certainly things that can be happening with a decision are just to make a decision based on a gut feeling, right? And so one can flip a coin and make a decision that might require or might deserve a little bit more attention than that. And lastly, one of the things that we do in resolving our thinking is thinking more holistically. We try to average out all the things that we think are our objectives and really try and come out with something that serves everything a little bit and maybe doesn't serve anything well. And so with that, as we go forward, there's a number of ways that we look at our decision making that are influenced by how our brain works, and those are biases, right? Those are things that are stereotypically things that we try to avoid, but also it's important to recognize that these are part of how we functionally work in nature, right? We have evolved to be reasonable decision makers with very little information. In some cases, extremely little information. If you're listening to the radio and you hear a voice and you've had the experience where someone asks you, what do you think this person looks like? Very often your brain can come up with a construct based on just the voice alone that is an estimate. It's based on your biases. And in most cases, it's way off, but it's a tool that's there to fill in the pieces that we don't know. And so in doing so, we end up picking satisfactory solutions for many of our questions. And we do that rather than optimizing. So there's a number of things to consider here, but the important outcome of this, when we're thinking about how we view things, it's important to realize that we're wrong very often, right? We have this tool and this toolkit to go and fill in information we don't have, and it serves us very well in order to make high probability decisions, but things aren't always what they seem, right? And as Plato said, the first appearances will deceive. And so there's a lot of work that has gone into characterizing the types of biases that we have. And these tendencies include things that we're pretty familiar with. Things like a sunk cost, it's if you're in for a penny, in for a pound. Escalating commitment, this idea of continuing to invest in the status quo. And for those of us who are recipients of long-term data sets, well, it's 30 years long. How can we not sample 1 year more? Motivational bias, things that allow self-interest to change how we decide, and confirmational bias, the things where they are going to go and support our own beliefs. And the last one that I'll put in here is anchoring bias, this idea to really have undue influence of the things we're familiar with to define a starting point. What's important for this is that I'm not talking about things that are consciously available to us, but things that we are unconsciously governed by to different degrees. And in doing so, it changes how we decide and what we decide, and versus having more of a logical outcome. So here's a question. If we go through and we start to look at how anchoring bias works, for example, you can ask the question, is there, if you ask an individual, is $35,000 enough for you to earn for your professional career, right? That number is going to influence how much you would answer for what you would need to be successful. Similarly, again, along the same line here, you can increase the number for that output if you had originally asked, is that person going to be, is $55,000 going to be enough for a person for that professional job? And, you can see how that affects the outcome. If we were in person, we could do this and set up in groups and that sort of thing. But the important thing is, there's a reason why people who are selling things late at night are saying, how much would you pay for this now? $200? No, but wait, right? It's the idea that even though we know about it as a sales pitch, it still works. we're still anchored by these things. And so that's a pretty trivial example. But let me tell you a couple stories here about some of the different biases that we can encounter in fisheries. And so the first story is about unabashedly my favorite fish, the American shad. And in this case, in the Penobscot River, there were a lot of things that have happened over the last decade or so. And so the Penobscot River Restoration Project, if you're not familiar with it, was a concerted effort to change connectivity in that system. And it involved some really drastic actions, including the removal of two dams, Great Works and VZ dams, that was going to open up access to the upper river in concert with effective fish passage at the next dam, Milford Dam there. And so if we look at American shad, there was a lot of uncertainty associated with their presence in the river and how they carried out their life history, because at the first dam, which had relatively poor fish passage with respect to non-salmon migratory fish, it was right at the head of tide, and the American shad were restricted in spawning to only a dozen or so kilometers downstream, and people didn't really know how many were there, because over the decades there were only a few dozen shad that had passed that fishway, and they were passing these fish in a fishway that was known to be poor for American shad, right? So it had really limited habitat, a fishway that wasn't effective for shad, so you knew you had bad data, and relatively few fish coming up. What was known, though, was that there was data from other rivers, and that is part of the story I want to tell you about the anchoring bias associated with estimations for the Penobscot River. So in 2009, the state, both the Inland Fish and Wildlife Service as well as Department of Marine Resources, really undertook what was a leadership role in writing out an operational plan for diadromous fish in the Penobscot River. And what they sought to do was restore American shad to that river, and they proposed to do so using stocking. And that stocking was really justified because of an absence of information about the presence of shad in that river. And so I've already painted the picture that very few fish had passed the first dam. They wanted to restore them, but there was uncertainty associated with how many were there. And so what they did was said, all right, there's got to be about 1,000 fish in the river. And there's an asterisk there, because that asterisk was down to a footnote that linked DMR's assumption to the idea that the remnant population that's in the Penobscot River has to be similar to the size of the remnant population that's in another river down south, right, the Saco River. Only the problem was that they didn't really have data for the Saco River either, because the Saco River did not have effective fish passage, but did have counts at the first dam. And what they found was that when they opened up that fishway in the Saco River, they had, a few hundred to up to 1,000 fish passing annually. And they were linked to that number in terms of what they were going to put forth as an estimate in the Penobscot River. And this isn't throwing anybody under the bus. We're all asked to do this, is to use best available information in order to come up with numbers. And in this case, they were linking it to a different river and numbers that really didn't match. Turns out over the next few years, after the dams were removed, the woman that I'm showing here, Ann Grota, ended up doing some work with some radio telemetry and some DIDSIN, showing that there was a far greater incidence of American shad in the lower river, and captures at the first dam, Milford, ended up going into the thousands and have reached more than 10,000 in the last year. So that was some of what shaped the decision not to stop. So a second story that I can reach out to, and one that Matt Altenritter is quite familiar with, is the story of short-nosed sturgeon on the Penobscot River as well. And so these were a fish that were thought to be extirpated from the Penobscot River. And over time, there came some stories of fishermen catching a couple of these guys and really spurring on some studies that were led by Gail Zydlewski and Mike Kinnison to look at their presence and their behavior. And so one of the assumptions that really popped out from how these fish were managed was the idea that these fish tend to spend relatively little time in the ocean. And so the idea was that they were really confined largely to freshwater, and they would only make quick and limited movements into the marine environment, generally staying close to shore. And so what happened was, by in more than a decade of telemetry now, has ended up providing a lot of information about fish in the Penobscot River and how they move, and what the end result has been sets of data that look like this. And here, if we're looking at on the y-axis is the river extent, and you can think of kilometer 0 as being near the ocean. And you can see the detections in river on a seasonal basis across the x-axis. And what you can see are these two inconvenient lobes of the data that occur seasonally. And those were the first indications that these fish were leaving the system, and it was associated with spawning, such that it became clear in working with colleagues that these fish were leaving the Penobscot River and going out into the ocean long distances, going into the Kennebec and spawning, and then making return trips. And so that is a series of observations that fundamentally changed how sturgeon have been viewed, and hopefully change how they would be managed as well. The next story I'm going to tell you about is a story about Atlantic salmon adults. And this one is, most people are pretty familiar with the plight of Atlantic salmon in the U.S. They certainly have struggled over the last century and a half to two, and their numbers are really a small fraction of what they have been historically. In terms of their life history, they would have a natural life history that would be linked to the freshwater, where the eggs are laid, they grow up as a young of the year and par, they move out to the ocean as smolts, and then as adults return back into the river, where they ascend and complete the cycle after finding mate. So what happens in reality now in this endangered population is that, or I should say, the important part there is that those adults, after their spawning, have the ability to move back out to the ocean and return and do it again. Those are kelts or repeat spawners. And so in our unnatural history, what happens is these fish now return, get captured at the first dam, get transported unceremoniously to a hatchery where they are artificially spawned, and their progeny are put back out into fresh water as either fry or smolts, and the cycle continues. What's a big question in their the maintenance and the conservation of the species is what to do with those fish after spawning. And historically, they've been really seen as, you know, an ancillary, a waste product, if you will, because you don't want necessarily those fish coming back and having overrepresentation in the population, or at least that's one of the arguments. But the question or the problem is that the biological importance of these fish can be really significant in rivers that don't have significant impoundments, right? So repeat spawners can be a small but a significant fraction of the population, 10, 15, 20% in unimpounded rivers. And because of their larger size means more eggs, better and larger eggs, they can end up having a disproportionate contribution to recruitment in out years. So surely, this important life history component would be a prominent piece of the Atlantic Salmon Recovery Plan, right? And if you go and you take a look at the current recovery plan and look at a little bit of a word analysis, you can take a look at usage within that document and look at the relative presence of kelts versus other terms for other life history stages, and it just pales. When you read through that, the idea that kelts or repeat spawners are actually a fundamental part of the life history of this fish is absent. And the reason being, this is not because people aren't cognizant of the biology. It's because we've gotten used to the fact that these fish don't exist in the population. If we look at the repeat spawners in the Penobscot River just over the last few decades, what you see is number of salmon on the y-axis here and dates along the x-axis. What you can see is that little black bar, that little cookie stacked on the top of that, slowly declines and becomes undetectable in the recent years. And so because they're not there, they're not even thought of as that fundamental piece of the population. So the last example that I'm going to tell you about this is the story of damming and relicensing. And so when you look at dams across the landscape, those that are producing hydropower, you get licenses, and those licenses are renewed on a basis of about 40 years, and it can vary, but overall there's a stereotype process by which one can go through. And so if you look at that, the process for documenting dam relicensing can look at different segments of contribution on that timeline. And so you start out, there's application documents that are filled in by the hydropower operator. There's biological and habitat assessments that are again produced by the operator. You have these study reports and plans that feed in, again, by the operator. And then you have biological opinions that are fed in by the regulatory authorities. In this case, NOAA for a lot of the coastal rivers. And lastly, FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, comes in and then weighs evidence and information and provides feedback as well as decisions as to the renewal. And so document analysis has some warts, and it's not a perfect method, but it's an interesting insight into how individuals use best available science. And this is work Sarah Vogel has done, where she looked at the contributions from the operators and those based on what FERC has done by both their end impact statements as well as their feedback, as shown here for the biological and habitat assessments. So if we look at that, we can look at what people use as licensees, what is produced by the regulatory authority, and what FERC does. And looking just at a really broad brush here, looking at what people put in their bibliographies. And so if we look at the first thing that is observed by FERC, which is the feedback from the licensee, we can take a look and see the number of citations that are used. And so for the licensee, they're putting in 870 some odd on average across a number of watersheds citations. NOAA ends up using about double of those. And now if we ask what FERC takes away from both sources of data, you can look at their citation list and say that it's pretty clear that they are mirroring the first things that they are seeing. And so again, this is another example of how the anchoring can end up being part of how decisions are made within fisheries. So I know we go and we say these examples that I've given you are really linked to human tendencies, right? And what we're interested in is much more about how biases influence our science. We go out there and we measure things and we make determinations about how things are functioning in an ecological sense or in terms of making decisions to test hypotheses, right? So in that regard, I'm going to go back to a statement that really shaped me from when I was about 8 or 9 years old. My father handed me a cover from an advertisement from Cole Palmer, who's a manufacturer of some chemical analysis machinery. And I read on it, and it stuck with me from those early years that mathematics is the basis of all real knowledge. And that's an idea that I think is important to try and think about as we look at bias and visit the quantitative side of how bias can influence things. And so if we look at what bias is mathematically, it's the over or underestimation of the value of a parameter, right? And so if we look just qualitatively here at a value and we put a true value down and then we put an estimate down, that difference between the two is what we identify as being the bias. And so that's pretty easy to identify. And in some cases, some of the issues are trivial in terms of dealing with them. Others can get more sophisticated or more complicated. There's two problems here. Very often when we deal with bias, right, the true value may be unknown. So we don't know we have a bias unless we look for it. The other part is that there's variability in how we measure things, right? And so the two things in terms of the variability and how far off from an estimate we are can really muddy the water quite a bit. And so just to follow this through a little bit, if we go and we look at this graphically, we can take a look at how bias can be on a graph and how variability can be on a graph. And we start to recognize that we can have a situation where we have a little bit of bias with low error, or we could have an unbiased estimate with a lot of error. And it really matters whether or not you are in one bin or the other, whether or not you might be okay with bias or not. And what do I mean by that? This is, it can really kind of make one scratch one's head a little bit about the math end of these things. But let's look at a simple thing. You go out and you play darts, right? And this is going back to a basic statistical presentation where we can look at different distributions of our estimates of measuring something. And so we go through and we can say, all right, we can have precise things that are really repeatable. One is right on the target, one is off the target, right? We can have things that are accurate, right? So the top one is right on the target and with precise, but the lower one is both is accurate, though it's not very precise. And the last one is a dart player who may have really kind of mistaken what the skill level would be for. But the important thing that I want you to think about when you compare these is not sort of this idea of accuracy and precision as statistical entities, but whether or not, if option A were not available and you were playing with someone and you wanted a teammate to play darts, who would you ask to be your teammate, right? And it really matters a lot when you look at how big the bias is and how big the error is. And that relates directly to what we measure in a number of our professional exploits, from things that are very simple to those that are more complex. So the simplest one that I could come up with is the idea about how we length fish. Everybody has a length board that has been beat around for about 20 plus years, and it has some sort of old markings on it, either somebody's ruler that's been stuck on a board or markings with a Sharpie or something like that. And we know, intuitively, we know that as we measure a fish, that the length that we're getting is probably off by a little bit in terms of how that ruler was set, how we hold the fish, things like that, right? So there's a systematic bias that's inherent in our length boards, but we usually pay no attention to that, because what does it matter when you're measuring, a 30 centimeter fish on a board that might be off by a 0.5 millimeter, right? There's more sophisticated ways that bias and the accuracy and precision can come into play too. And this taps an example from one of the things that we do a lot in the laboratory is look at survival as fish are passing dams. And, in the simplest sense, how we measure survival is we tag a bunch of fish, we release them above a dam, look at our detections above the dam, we look at how many made it down below, and we come up with an estimate of survival. But it's a little bit more than that, because in the end, our detection probabilities are not complete. If they were, we'd just look at fractions, right? And so how we do this is by using a CJS model. And it's the details of this are not particularly important, but just the idea that we have parameters that are measured, survival for the reaches that are involved. And because detection is not perfect, we measure those parameters, the P's, for detection. And then at the end, we have some sort of unresolved values. And so the issue at hand when we're looking at bias or precision and accuracy here is that there are those who go and identify this area as a problem. Well, if the dam wasn't there, you would still expect there to be some level of mortality as fish move through that unimpounded reach, right? And so the elegant solution to this, and mathematically is quite impressive, is to say, all right, we're going to take a second release and pretend that it's representative of those that have passed, and then look at survival there as a function of the two releases. Now, the challenge here, aside from some of the arguments that say that this produces an unbiased estimate, but the challenge here is that if you're releasing fish with radio transmitters or something like that that cost a lot of money, you're generally not releasing like 10,000 fish. You're generally releasing 50, 100, 75, something like that. And by splitting up your releases, you're reducing your sample size. And by virtue of that, you can look at, in the simplest distilled fashion, that sample size and detection probability both positively affect precision in this approach. And I won't go any further down this road here. Certainly, there's a paper that's out, Hard Choices, that goes into painful detail about that trade-off. But the basic idea is that it matters. It matters what your variability is, and it matters what your precision is in order to make decisions about how you use your fish. So, as we go through, right, we try to understand deviation from the average, right? So our ability to go and infer things as scientists, as practitioners, is to be able to look at how data differs from our average. And so there's all kinds of ways we do this. Anytime you go through a paper and you see an AIC table like this, where you're testing different models, you're trying to go and account for the variability that you're seeing, right? It's a way to understand the patterns we see in a systematic fashion and account for things like temperature, the location of sampling, whatever it is. In this case, it was looking at growth variability for brook trout and being able to try and identify what was affecting it. We can look at then from our models and try to say how an individual factor is going to change the outcome. Here we're looking at survival for American eels in the Penobscot River. And what we see is a clear association with river flow and the survival of eels that we see in that section. And so we try really hard to identify the patterns and characterize how variability is part of the story in order to better understand how things work in a given ecological system. So it's important to have both the idea of the central tendency as well as the variability. And so it makes complete sense that we should be able to think about that for how we make decisions as people too, right? And this gets back to the idea of our unconscious biases, right? It's important to know what the biases are in order to be able to account for them. And again, here we're talking about biases that are unconscious, people not trying to be specifically exclusionary. And so if we look at this in a very general sense, right, we have some interaction between people, and I try to think about this as a simplified distribution, that when we're an individual and we're reaching out to someone and communicating, we have some level of intent. We're trying to be inclusive or exclusive in some made-up axis here. And we have an intent that we're pretty sure of and have high confidence in. And what can happen is that our unconscious bias can shift from what we think, shown in green, to a level that here shown in red is identified as our bias, how our intent gets messed up. So it's a huge thing to really accept that what we think and what we think we say and what we believe can all be different things, especially then you add in the idea that people's perception of what we are doing can change as well. So on the other hand, right, you have the recipient, and what gets communicated then ends up having a point and some uncertainty associated with. And there's a fellow, Claude Steele, who's just come out with a book, Whistling Vivaldi, which really explores this in a lot of different senses. But where I want to go down on this is now to take a look at how this affects one potential avenue within fisheries, within STEM research. And that is the challenge of being a minority group. And I'm going to talk about the conundrum of gender stereotypes now in our field. And to do so, we're going to reach out and look at some data from some testing, and then take a look at how we interpret things. And so if we look at high school grade point averages, and this is from the AAUW report back in about a decade ago, you can take a look at grade point average here for different years of high school graduation and look at a gender difference. And you see there's a real clear difference in terms of grade point average between girls and boys. And it favors girls, right? If you go and you take a look over the same years and look at competitive tests, there's this gets flipped on its head, right? Competitive tests end up lagging behind in terms of performance for girls who are going through advanced placement. And so that's a real head scratcher, right? And so one of the things that I want to develop here is the idea that stereotypes, even if they're not true, can end up having a pervasive effect on how people perform. And this is important. So one of the neatest experiments that I had come across is this idea that stereotype threat can be a testable part of how we evaluate people's performance. And stereotype threat, it can be characterized as the anxiety that people have about being part of a group that is thought by someone else to underperform. And so that anxiety in itself can have an effect. What do I mean by that? So if we look at this work, and again, this is some work done back into the 90s. Claude Steele is on this, and looking at scoring on an exam in groups of men and women that are told that individuals who are male end up scoring better on this test than individuals who are female. When corrected for actual demonstrated ability, that information is correlated with the fact that the men end up performing greatly more than the women in that setting. In that experiment, if at the beginning of the experiment you tell them that, you know what, you may have heard that there's a lot of differences between men and women as they are performing on a given exam, this isn't one of those. Historically, men and women of equal ability end up testing the same. And so you do that and you get a stark result where the performance of men and women ends up being similar. And so to invoke one of the sages of our time, John Mellencamp, you know, I would say the important thing to take away from here is that what people believe about themselves and what other people believe about them can have an indirect effect on their performance based on the anxiety that it can cause. And that's huge if you're trying to manage people and you want them to work at the level that is best. So I'm going to go and a little bit more personal here, because back some decades ago, my life changed quite a bit, and I was exposed to a lot of things that as a white male going through graduate school, I didn't have. And, you know, this is my wife, Gail, for those of you who don't know me. And back in year 2000, our life changed markedly. There's my son now, who just turned 21 yesterday. And I started to hear stories about where Gail went to school, and her first biology class, she was told by the professor that he doesn't even know why women are taking biology, because they're just going to have families and leave school anyway. And that should just be teaching males. Now, we're not spring chickens anymore, and I get that. Well, people say that that could be from, a time that's a little bit different. But just from a few years ago, when we look at things like pay scale within the University of Maine, we can look at both males and females within a department and correct for years since those people have had PhDs. You can see that there's about a $10,000 gap in the males and females that are being paid at the University of Maine in that department. So if you hear that and you say, so you think you're doing okay, I certainly am guilty of that. And I had a conversation with a grad student who ended up having a lot of good conversations with. And it came out that, working on this talk on diversity. And I said, yeah, you know what? I try to be cognizant of it and do okay. And she said, yeah, you're better than most. That wasn't exactly the ringing endorsement that I wanted. And that was a real highlight that even if you're aware of what you're doing, even if you think you're trying, there's still a lot of room for improvement. And so I'm going to just ask you to remember a few things and then end with a quick story here. One is, biases really are important in that how we function, they allow us to effectively process huge amounts of information and to make decisions, right? That's one of the things that are a functional part of our toolbox. But both in our science and in our social interactions, it's really important to have an idea of how accurate we are in thinking about what the value is, and also how uncertain our data are and how we're being communicated to and with. And the last thing here is that unconscious bias is just that. And so recognition of unconscious bias is not a process that is without effort. And I'm going to just end with a quick story from a book. If you haven't read it, The Hidden Brain by Shankar Vedantam. It is one that is, I think, well worth the consumption. And he tells a very effective story about how he goes out and went out for a swim and was unaware of the current that he was swimming in until he actually tried to go and swim against it. And he likened that to what we see in our culture today, that, for those of us who are being carried along with the current, very often it's easy to credit ourselves that, well, we worked hard for where we are and that sort of thing. And it's really the important moment is to be able to acknowledge and identify the current that many other people are swimming against, and how there's ways that we can help to lessen that difference. So with that, I would be, if there's time, happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Joe, for that talk. I'm wondering if folks have questions for Joe that he can address in the next couple minutes. You can either raise your hand in the chat or simply unmute yourself and speak up, please.
This is always the challenge. We talked about this somewhere around 7:30. the great pause of our new virtual world. So
Yeah.
I appreciate positive input. Yeah.
So I guess, Joe, then I'll ask a question. In the context of up and coming professionals, students, young professionals, what do you suppose are some of the maybe practical ways that they can use to identify this unconscious bias, or at least be more intentional about tackling it and recognizing it?
Sure. I think one of the things that I would say is that being more willing to actually engage in conversation is probably the most important thing. One of the things that I recognize, and I think everyone recognizes, the discomfort that we all have about engaging with somebody's statement or conduct that is borderline, that you don't really know what the intent is. And I'm certainly no expert on this in any regard, but I think one of the things that I've found to be effective, or I should say, start with what's ineffective. Ineffective is calling somebody out and just making a point of them in front of people. I think one of the things that you can do is really be a mentor to people, and this involves not just people who are younger than you or earlier in your career, but reaching out. I consider myself to be mentored very often by my grad students who have a very different social experience and presence than I do, and being able to have that comfortable conversation to say, that was kind of a dumb thing to say. What did you mean by that? And in being able to engage in that way, I think does help. There's, what I'm talking about here is not prejudice. Prejudice is that special form of bias that we all know and love in our communities. This is about trying to capture how we think differently and how we present ourselves differently, even when our intents are more noble.
Thanks, Joe. Lisa Kerr has a question for you. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hey, Joe. This is Lisa. I guess it's more of a comment. I really appreciate you addressing this topic, and like Matt said, I know it's an uncomfortable space sometimes to talk about, but the conversation is needed, and just having the conversation is a great start. And I think on the kind of Matt's question about what can you folks actively do, I encourage people to kind of look at their faculty pages in their departments, look at their list of keynote speakers at conferences you're going to, look at your networks. Is there diversity represented in those? Look at your webpage. Is diversity represented in the web pages of your institutions and your list of project PIs? There's lots of places to look and kind of just ask questions, and sometimes you can kind of push the envelope there where there may be an unintentional lack of representation. And so I just really appreciate you having this conversation in this venue.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and all those things are great ideas. I would add just to that and say, be persistent, because in my decade and a half that I've been in my department, we have gone from a situation where the idea of, hey, we should really work to get more diverse students in our department was greeted with, well, we visited that. We're Maine, we really can't really do that, to one where people are working harder to it. And so, keeping the conversation going, being persistent about it. Everybody is a work in process here. And so it can be a real challenge. How difficult do you think it would be? I don't think that would be difficult at all. the question, I guess, I don't know if it was me or directed to everybody at once, but the idea of a seminar or some way to engage people in a systematic way, I think regardless of if it's in academia or within a group, right? A lot of people listening are with Fish and Wildlife Service or with a state agency. There's many different venues that we all inhabit, and it's really trying to make sure that that message is heard. I will say one of the best places to bring it up is in those times when hiring is done. And so, you know, whenever that there's a hiring event, making sure that there is as part of the standard operating procedure, a discussion about how to engage in an inclusive way. Time and time again, I've been on hiring committees where, it's very difficult not to see certain tendencies and link them to biases that people have, whether it be to gender, race, or just even age and where they're coming from in the country. So all of those things end up being important things.
Do other folks have questions they'd like to ask Joe?
Yeah, I have a question. Chris Osborne here. Really cool talk. I'm a big fan. In addition to liking conservation ecology, I'm also a big fan of the behavioral economics with Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. A big fan of their work. But so this is cool to merge those two worlds. But when I think about sort of the framing effect and anchoring issues you talked about early on, I think about outreach and how not only are there certain biases we have as scientists trying to reach out to people, the more data we show, the more convincing, right? I come from a low income, undereducated family. I think a lot of my family would roll their eyes if I threw up statistics at them. And I think to some extent we do a good job of considering those differences. But I think in considering reaching out to some of the communities, like there's a lot of stakeholders that are missed by some of our outreach efforts, and I think gaining a better understanding of our biases might help improve in that field.
I agree. I guess there's one thing that I'll comment on. At the beginning, you talked about the importance of showing more data, and one of the conundrums I think that we have as scientists is that how we function amongst ourselves differs fundamentally from how the general public consumes and interprets information. And that is that when people hold a belief that is near their core, near their psychological core, the production and the arguments of more logical data has the exact opposite effect of what you would intend. You can see this with things about the climate change, and that people who fundamentally are linking climate change to their political views, if you provide direct, scientific, convincing information, that actually entrenches them further into the opposite direction that you had intended. But your other point is well taken, though, as well, and that is that there's a lot of different venues that we have, and as people who are engaged in things that often are really visually, and at least beyond the when we get out of the zombie apocalypse here, are very effective in terms of being able to touch, smell, feel. There's lots of opportunities there, and those can be very innovative. And frankly, AFS has done a good job at different levels, and I'm particularly proud of the AFS subunit here at the university that really engages with people and makes an effort to reach out and participate in, such as the Wabanaki youth, and able to work on diversity and women in science and have different presentations there. And that goes back to what Kara had mentioned in terms of like a seminar. AFS already has a toehold in a lot of different areas, and they should feel empowered to go and take the lead on making those things happen.
All right. So I think at this point, maybe we should wrap up and transition to our next speaker. But I wanted to again say thank you, Joe, for joining us today and presenting to everyone. I think your talk was very well received. So thank you. We appreciate it.
This has been a real highlight. Thank you all.
Hey, Lisa. I'm glad you got your internet working again.
I did. Thank you.
All right. So I think we can jump to our next speaker, Lisa Holst. I have a brief intro for you, Lisa. Lisa has worked for the New York Department of Environmental Conservation for 29 years. And her experiences at that department are pretty diverse. She's worked in tidal wetland protection, habitat restoration, fish and wildlife conservation, and most recently as the head of the Rare Fish Unit in the Bureau of Fisheries. And just a few days ago, we were also talking about her dabbling in freshwater mussel research. So quite a diverse spectrum. She holds a degree in marine biology, though she says that she's finally come to terms with not being a world-renowned clownfish research, although maybe there's still time for that, right? And then if you are interested in finding Lisa at our next in-person meeting, fingers crossed, you should look for her potentially with knitting needles in her hand. I think that might help her stand out a bit at the next meeting. So with that, Lisa, thanks for doing this. We all appreciate it, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Hold on, I hit the wrong window for my presentation. Try this again. Okay. So good morning, everybody. Sorry I'm late to my own talk. Thank you so much for joining